You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Nearly 17 years ago, when my wife, Mary Jane, and I decided to get married, I must confess I didn't put a lot of thought into it. It really was the furthest thing from my mind. And that's because we had just purchased a house together, and my attention, well, was more focused on packing, moving everything to the new home, and of course, unpacking. And then, we hadn't even settled in, but a few weeks later, we tied the knot in our backyard. It was a small ceremony, just 28 people, and that included the two of us. But the thing we feared most was that it had been raining the entire summer. I'm talking about downpour day after day after day, which meant that we most likely be married on our back porch. And I guess I should explain that the porch runs the entire length of the house, and it has a roof over the top. It's a very large back porch. But to fit 28 people on there, that would have been a tight squeeze. Luckily for us, however, the rain stopped a couple of days before the wedding, and we were married under beautiful sunny skies. It really was perfect. Now, my mind was so busy dealing with other things that I really never stopped to consider even the most basic of things. For example, I don't recall us ever discussing whether or not Mary Jane would take my last name. Of course, the subject must have come up at some point, but I don't really have much of a recollection of it. I have some vague memory of saying something to the effect like we're both in our mid-40s, and I didn't think Mary Jane should give up her identity. So of course it should come as no surprise to anyone that she didn't take my last name. The funny part is that we do get occasional envelopes addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Silverman, but I have to say that's pretty rare. My favorite, however, is from acquaintances who know she doesn't have my last name, but they don't know what it is. So the letters or cards or whatever they are, they're mailed to Steve Silverman and Mary Jane, and they just leave off her last name. It just gives us a nice chuckle from time to time. The second thing I never put any thought into was rings. And that question I do remember a bit better. Mary Jane had come to me just a few days before the ceremony, and she asked if I wanted to wear a wedding ring. We hadn't purchased anything at that point, and I gave her my typical imprecise response. I said something like, "Not really." And that was basically it. I should tell you I have nothing against wearing rings. It's just that I had never worn one. I was 45 years old at that point, never wore a ring, hadn't put much thought into it at all. So believe it or not, the two of us never purchased rings. We don't have wedding rings. She doesn't have an engagement ring. And honestly, it's made no difference in our lives. And the last thing I'm going to mention actually took place after we were married, and that's because I had a tough time referring to Mary Jane as my wife. I recall for several weeks after that, my best friend Jamie kept correcting me. Every time I'd say Mary Jane, Jamie would follow up with my wife. And the problem wasn't that I felt uncomfortable marrying Mary Jane. It's just that every time I said my wife, I got this creepy feeling deep down inside that I was treating her like a possession, like I somehow owned her, which I had no desire to do. So, of course, here we are together almost 17 years, and I have gotten used to calling Mary Jane my wife. So it should come as no surprise that the title of today's story, Rent-A-Wife, would also come with a bit of that uneasiness. It just sounds like a service that could be listed in the back of an adult men's magazine, but I assure you that there's no hanky-panky involved in this story at all. It's just a fun little story from the late 1970s, early 1980s, in which a number of housewives opted to market the skills that they knew best, those of being a wife. Plus, if you hang around until the end of the story, you'll get to hear the audio of an interview I did with a woman who really ran one of those rent-a-wife businesses. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
Before I begin, I just want to issue a bit of a warning, and this is similar to the ones you hear from time to time on This American Life. And that is, while there's nothing explicit in this episode, nothing at all, there is some acknowledgement of sex and sexuality, so just be aware of that. It's quite the rarity, but last week I took a vacation from the podcast, and I have to tell you, I traveled a long, long distance to get to my destination. It was all the way up to the second floor of our house into our laundry room. I guess I should tell you that I began working on the cabinetry, the doors, the moldings months and months ago, maybe even close to a year ago, but life had just seemed to get in the way and I never finished the project. Complicating things is that our house is over 100 years old, so nothing is square, and every molding, everything I put in place had to be custom fit. It took forever, but now I can say our laundry room is finally done. I am glad to have that behind me. Anyway, I woke up Saturday morning and I set my sights on picking out the next story for this podcast. And as I went through the possibilities, some were set aside simply because they take far more time to research and write than the little time I had allotted for myself. And then there were others I discarded simply because they were similar in theme to episodes I had recently recorded. Eventually, I did whittle it down to the story you're about to hear, but all I had at that point was 3 articles bookmarked and a few notes that I had recorded at the time I found the story. In other words, I had a lot of research to do. But one of those articles was from the June 20th, 1980 edition of the Petaluma Argus-Courier, and the headline on the story was, "Desperate? Try renting a wife." And it went on to describe a new business that 38-year-old Petaluma, California resident Karen Donovan had recently launched. She named it Rent-A-Wife. According to Karen, who had divorced after what she claimed was 13 years, 8 months, and 23 days of marriage.
I was sitting around trying to decide what to do with my life and to figure out where my expertise lay. It suddenly occurred to me that I was better at being a wife than any other profession since I've done it for almost 14 years.
That's when a friend who had run a successful rent-a-wife business in nearby Berkeley suggested that Karen try doing the same. Supposedly they had more business than they could deal with, but one of the business partners decided to quit and the other one decided to close up shop. As a little side note, I do believe I figured out who those 2 women were, and I'll get back to that later in the story. Well, Karen decided to give it a try, and she began by taking out 2 small ads in the Bay Guardian and Pacific Sun. Those are 2 San Francisco Bay alternative papers. And then she coupled that with some small press releases that she thought would end up in the trash. But they didn't, and that's how she ended up being featured in the Argus-Courier. So you're probably sitting there thinking, just what does a rent-a-wife business entail? I think a portion of the text of one of her ads explains it well.
Rent-A-Wife will greet your guests and entertain them, shop for presents and food, decorate and oversee decorators, pay your bills for you, select your appliances, arrange your home and office moves, type and do research, search for your ancestors, give your parties, care for your home while you're away, do your errands, arrange your vacation and travel. Watch your soap operas and report happenings, meet friends and relatives at the airport, help you with time management and budget, write and answer your letters, consult with you on your wardrobe buying, or just ask.
I have to tell you that's quite the mouthful, but Karen was quick to point out that the just ask portion did not mean that her service was rent-a-mistress.
Sex and money don't mix. It takes all the fun out of it.
Karen noted.
There's nothing wrong with enjoying being a wife. I think there's a real need for wives nowadays. Even married couples who both work need the talents of a wife.
Karen charged $25 per hour, $150 a day, and $600 a week. If you adjust that for inflation, that's nearly $100 per hour, $580 per day, or $2,300 per week.
We are not cheap. Wives cost a lot of money. They're worth big bucks. Our prices are modest compared to the value of a wife.
For that kind of money, Rent-A-Wife was clearly not marketing itself as a maid or babysitting service. And to ensure their safety, all of her employees worked in pairs. While Karen was the company's only full-time employee, she noted,
I've got 6 part-time Rent-A-Wives on my staff, and 2 of them are male.
Now, the surrogates, as they recall, were each paid $10 of the $25 per hour that Karen charged each customer. She was also quick to point out that her entire staff was well qualified. Their real jobs ranged from attorney and legal assistant to one who was a marine biologist. And Karen was no slouch either. She spent years working as a legal secretary for the Army. She was a notary public, had served as a Sonoma County court clerk, managed property, had been a college student, and organized Tupperware parties. That's something you don't hear about much anymore. As the expression goes, a little publicity goes a long way. It wasn't long before Karen was fielding more than 100 phone calls every single day. Of course, some were from potential clients, others are from women who wished to set up their own Rent-A-Wife franchise, but perhaps most significantly, Karen received numerous inquiries from the media. That included countless radio shows, Newsweek magazine, the London Daily Mail, Good Morning America, and probably most significant for that time period, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. And get this, the NBC television network even expressed interest in creating a situation comedy series based on her Rent-A-Wife concept. I'll throw in one more, a Ripley's Believe It or Not strip that ran in newspapers everywhere. Written below a sketch of her face, it said, quote, Karen Donovan of Petaluma, California is the founder of a firm called Rent-A-Wife, which rents household supervisory personnel at a charge of $600 per week, unquote. You know what this all means. Karen Donovan was suddenly a minor celebrity and Rent-A-Wife was receiving nationwide attention.
I really don't have time to be running around the country for these interviews, but I ask myself, why not? I'm just riding this thing right now. When all the fanfare dies down, maybe I'll get back to doing business. What I really need right now is a vacation.
Things were getting so crazy that Karen had to hire a Beverly Hills lawyer to handle the more complicated details of running the business. The first step was to copyright the Rent-A-Wife name, plus she applied for federal trademarks for both Rent-A-Wife and Rent-A-Husband. And being a mother with 2 teenage boys, 2 dogs, and 2 cats in the house, she joked about setting up a rent-a-family service. Karen imagined it would work something like this.
We'll come over and mess up your house, and then you call Rent-A-Wife to straighten the mess out.
Of course, choosing the name Rent-A-Wife did come with its share of complaints, and that's mainly because some felt it reinforced the idea that wives are subservient to their husbands, and it implied that the services helped to fulfill male fantasies. I'll let you fill in the blanks on that one. Karen pointed out in one interview,
I should have called her Rent-A-Person, but if I did that, they wouldn't get the drift of what we do.
And Karen dealt with those complaints head on.
That's so wrong. I'm trying to professionalize wives, show them how much their skills really mean. I think a wife is worth a fortune.
In another interview, she noted that
a lot of women have called me to say they think it is wonderful and that it does a lot for the self-esteem of women. I was just dying to take a wife and put her into the category of a doctor or a lawyer. I didn't know that I had a little woman's cause here, but that's exactly what I have here.
And to get the point across that everything that her company did was above board, her staff members all wore t-shirts that bore the expression, quote, anything but sex, unquote. All this publicity was great, but the real question was whether or not Karen ever made any money with her Rent-A-Wife business. A story published about 1 month after that initial Argus Courier article described how she'd only had 4 clients up until that point. So did she take on more? I'm guessing she did. But whether or not Karen was successful, that question remains unanswered. When 80-year-old Karen Donovan passed away on August 25th of 2022, her obituary noted she had retired after a 22-year career in the U.S. Army and that she had worked an additional 20 years as a special investigator in the insurance industry. But there was one glaring omission, and that was there was no mention of her Rent-A-Wife business. Normally that would have been the end of the story, but I began to wonder if the Rent-A-Wife concept originated with Karen or not. My conclusion is that while Karen Donovan brought fame to the concept, she definitely was not the first. There have been occasional mentions of renting a wife over the previous century, and that included a man who in 1968 wished to rent his 21-year-old wife for 3 months for £50 or $120. Apparently he had broken into a store and stolen some cigarettes, and they needed the money to pay the fine. His wife told the press, quote, anything is better than having Peter in jail, unquote. That's clearly a quirky story, but it's definitely not what I was searching for. Instead, I believe it all began with a July 10th, 1978 story that columnist Bob Greene wrote for the Chicago Tribune. Then, days later, it was syndicated to newspapers all across the United States. The headline on the article was "The Playful Renting a Wife to Surrogate with Love." He then jumped down to the third paragraph and it reads, quote, "Enter the country's first rent-a-wife service," unquote. In the story, Bob talked about a New York woman named Emma Freed who, quote, "started the rent-a-wife company," unquote. She told him,
"It seemed inevitable to me. There is a definite need. I have been working as a surrogate wife for 12 years, but for just one client at a time. Then I realized the time was right to go into it all the way, as a business available to people who want to rent wives on a part-time basis."
The 44-year-old Mrs. Freed named her company the Surrogate Wife, and she advertised her services in some unnamed New York publications. Her fee was $20 for the first hour, $15 for each additional hour. And just what did a surrogate wife do?
A wife for hire. It's much more than a secretary. There are millions of secretaries you can hire, but in this day and age, a lot of people aren't looking for a secretary. When you come right down to it, they're looking for a wife. A wife will do whatever needs to be done for a man. I'm not talking about sexual things, of course. That's not what my service is all about. I'm talking about things like getting the refrigerator fixed if it's broken. Think about that. If you don't have a wife, that's a real crisis. With my wife rental service, you merely pick up the phone and say, "The refrigerator's broken," and I get it fixed. The list of services is virtually endless, you know. A wife shops for a man, takes care of furnishing his home, buys his clothes, hangs his pictures, picks out his wallpaper, takes care of his bank books to make sure they're balanced, unpacks his crates, arranges parties, acts as hostess. Listen, whatever a man needs to have done, that's what a wife does, both in real life and in my service.
Further in the article, she continued,
Unfortunately, I believe that the word wife has become a dirty word. I'm trying to change that. I don't happen to agree that being a wife is a bad thing. There's a great deal of satisfaction in being a wife. A wife is a nurse, a helper, a teacher. What a wife does is worth a great many dollars an hour. And if a lot of women aren't willing to do that work anymore, well, I am.
On February 21st of 1979, that's about 7 months after Bob Green's story, the Berkeley Gazette ran a story about two women named Mary Ann and Laughing Water Pomegranate, and they had launched a business. Can you guess what it was called? Rent-A-Wife. Now, their real names were Mary Ann and Michelle Smith, and they explained in the article that they got the idea for Rent-A-Wife after reading that article about Emma Freed's surrogate wife service. So do you remember earlier when I mentioned that Karen Donovan got her idea for Rent-A-Wife from a friend in Berkeley who ran a successful Rent-A-Wife business, but then was forced to close it after her partner quit? Now, there's no way to prove this, but my guess is that one of those two pomegranate women, one of them was Karen's friend. Then 3 months after the Berkeley Rent-A-Wife story appeared, the Courier News in New Jersey reported on two women. They were Gail Kennedy and Freddie Kaiser, who had started a similar business. And they chose a very original name, Rent-A-Wife. And once again, their story was picked up by newspapers and radio stations all across the nation. But it didn't quite work out well for them. That's because one of the papers was the Columbus Dispatch, which ran the story on its front page, and that caught the attention of reader Diane Whitish, who ran another Rent-A-Wife business in Ohio. In this case, however, Diane had a leg up on all her competitors, and that's because she owned the federal trademark for Rent-A-Wife. The beauty of the internet is I was able to search the U.S. Patent Office's records, and they show that she filed for the trademark on November 20th of 1978, but she had begun using it the previous July. That just happened to be the same month that Bob Green ran his story in the Chicago Tribune. Now, once again, I can't prove this, but my hunch is that she read Bob Green's article, started a business called Rent-A-Wife, and quickly went to register the trademark. A little side note is that the Rent-A-Wife trademark was canceled on December 22nd of 1988, which means it is available. So if you're an enterprising person and want to start your own Rent-A-Wife business, the name is free and clear. Whitish, whose business employed 23 women and had franchises in Florida, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Georgia, she called Kennedy and Kaiser to inform them that they were infringing on her trademark.
I called Freddie and Gail and told them they had 3 choices. They can change their name, they can cease and desist, or they can buy a franchise from me.
Which one would you choose? Well, they opted to change the name. Soon after this, a number of rent-a-wife businesses just seemed to pop up everywhere. How many of these had licensed the name from Diane Whitish? Well, I really don't know, but one could rent a wife in Arizona, Massachusetts, Oregon, Texas, Wisconsin, and on and on and on. When I was doing my research, it just seemed like the classified ads were filled with ads for rent-a-wife. I should also add that doesn't include the variations on the name. There was rent-a-kid, rent-a-husband, rent-a-hubby, rent-a-grandma, rent-a-housewife, rent-a-perfect wife, and so on. Personally, I was thinking of doing rent-a-husband myself, but it turns out that trademark's still in use. As I said, one would typically find these businesses in the classified sections of the local newspapers, but full-length stories did appear from time to time. For example, there was a 1980 Pittsburgh Press story about 32-year-old Sonia Baxter, and her business model, I have to say, wasn't very different from all the others. What amused me most about the story is what she had printed on her business cards. She said that she would do, quote, anything from A to Z except X. While researching the story, I found the same 3 rent-a-wife businesses just kept coming up over and over again. The first, of course, was Petaluma's Karen Donovan, but her fame was short-lived. There was barely another mention of her in the press 1 month after her story exploded in the media. Then there was Toronto resident Judith Blackman, who was 50 years old when she launched Rent-A-Wife in 1980. Amazingly, the company's still in business. The Toronto location is operated by daughter Chris, while the Rent-A-Wife in Ottawa is run by daughter Laurel. If you check out their website, it's rentawife.ca. Of course, it's Canada, so rentawife.ca. They have an entire page titled About Our Name. And here's what the first paragraph says.
The name Rent-A-Wife was chosen in 1980 by our mother and feminist Judith Blackman following an epiphany. She purposely wanted to reflect the incalculable value that women give to the home. Judith's belief in those days was that the work women did in the home was undervalued and underpaid. She wanted to elevate the tasks of the homemaker and legitimize the work performed of that of a salaried position, lending dignity rather than degradation to housework. The vision of Ms. Blackman was to provide a service by women for women to cook, clean, shop, organize moves, do minor repairs, and walk the kids home from school for a fee.
And it goes on from there. The third rent-a-wife business that received significant press coverage was in Hadley, Massachusetts. Jane Hanne, a divorced mother of 5, started the business back in 1980. But she quickly ran into the same problem as those 2 women in New Jersey. She was told that the Rent-A-Wife name was trademarked. So she changed the name to Jane of All Trades and successfully ran that business until Friday, June 25th of 1993. Now, of the 3 women most prominently covered by the press, I knew that Karen Donovan had passed on. Judith Blackman, if she was still alive, would be at least 95 years old, and I was unsure what happened to Jane Hanne. But I was determined to find out, and it took quite a bit of detective work on my part, but I finally did locate Jane. And I have to tell you, I am thrilled that she's agreed to join me on the podcast today. Well, Jane, thanks for joining me. I'm very happy you agreed to do this. Why don't you quickly introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, I'm Jane Hanne. I am now Jane Nevensmith. Hanne was my maiden name. And I chose to use that when I had Rent-A-Wife because I didn't want to be looked up in the phone book. We're talking back in 1980, early 80s.
So, Jane, I thought we'd just go back to the beginning. How did you end up in Hadley?
Well, it took me a lot of time to get here. So originally, when I grew up, and this is critical to the Rent-A-Wife story, I have an older brother and a father who was very interested in teaching both of us all the skills he had, both mechanical, electrical, and carpentry. So at a very early age, I was able to do a lot. I remember a story my parents told when they went to parents' night for first grade, and I was in a very, I guess, progressive school then in Great Neck, New York, where the girls took shop and the boys took home ec. And the shop, there were parents in the shop saying, "Why does my daughter have to learn this?" And the shop teacher said, "Well, there's one girl in this class who knows the name of every tool and how to use it. Guess who?" So, and I didn't know. I mean, I went along, and when I was in the process of getting divorced, I got a job as the administrative assistant to the affirmative action director at the University of New Hampshire. And we were doing all of these women equality things. It was the time of Title IX. And I said to the director, "Why don't these women know anything?" And she said, "You're very unusual, but you only know your own experience." And since I knew it, I assumed everybody knew all the things I knew. Anyway, so then I was different. All right, moving along, I got divorced and I was looking for a job, and an engineer I had worked for years ago when we were in a college community, writing a program text in thermodynamics and publishing an engineering review book journal, asked me to come and run his business. He was running on energy systems. So I moved to Hadley to do that. That's how I got to Hadley.
So how did you go from that to running a rent-a-wife business?
Okay, so after a few years, his business closed. And I had recently read an article in the paper about some woman, I think she was in Ohio, who had a business called Rent-A-Wife. And I thought, that's a great name. And those are the things I can do. So I decided I would start a business called Rent-A-Wife. My father was horrified. My brother called me up and said, "What are you going to say if somebody calls you up and wants sex?" I said, "I never thought about it." And he said, "Well, here's your answer. You just laugh and say, 'What, with you for $10 an hour?'" So I did that once when I had one call, and then I didn't get any more calls about that. The other thing that made me feel really good about having just recently worked in the affirmative action office was that we're now talking 1981. I was charging $10 an hour, and that was a lot of money back then. But I had hired people to work for me, and I wanted to give them a reasonable wage, as well as I was running a business. I had to cover my costs. So I was in the mall one day and I overheard a conversation saying, "Well, he can pay $10 an hour if he wants to get somebody else to do the work I'm supposed to do." And I thought, okay, I've been validated. This is perfect. So it ended up that I had, I can't remember, 17 people working for me with a secondary office up in the northern part of Massachusetts, just because travel was easier to distribute from two different places than one.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, the woman who had called me looking for work, who lived up there, was also named Jane. So she was Jane of the North.
So I guess we should back up a bit. You started the business as Rent-A-Wife, but then you had to change the name. So why don't you go into that?
So I did have to change the name because after a while, the woman in Ohio contacted me and said, "You're using my name illegally. If you want to use it, you have to pay me. Otherwise, I'm going to sue you." And I thought, I can change my name. I'm out of here. So I changed it to Jane of All Trades, which was the same business, but different name. That went on until 1996, at which point, for a variety of reasons, I needed to stop doing that. So the people who I had working for me who were interested, I trained them all how to do their own business, and they all went independent.
Wow.
So I had taught them all how to do the bookkeeping and the tax paying and all of those things.
That's incredible.
So I'm now Jane of Less Trades.
Okay. What did the business entail, and did it change over time?
Yes. When I started, I thought the business was going to be the skills that I had in terms of house maintenance, I guess you would call it. And it was long before there were services like that. At first, when I started it, because I wanted it to be a real business, I went to the bank vice president and asked for a loan of $2,500 because I wanted to not use my money, but to keep it totally separate and have enough money for startup expenses. And I found it really interesting because this was a Black man that I was talking to, and he said to me, "A woman business doing that will never make it." So I was always amused afterwards. Every time I saw him on the street, I would wave and laugh to myself. Anyway, so yes, I made it for quite a while, and it was a successful business.
What did the business evolve into?
So originally, as I say, I was going to be doing things like painting for people or building bookshelves or, gardening, anything practical. And what I got, because we live in a college community, was calls for people who wanted reliable housekeeping. College students are great housekeepers unless they fall in love, have an exam, or go on vacation. And so they were looking for somebody who was stable. And if their specific person wasn't able to come, that there would be an alternative person I could send. And that opened it up to a whole different business. I mean, we still did the other part of the business, but I was able to hire single moms who had kids in school who wanted to work school hours. And that worked really well for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as I say, they were great. They loved their customers loved them. And they could say to their client, "Well, my daughter's doing a recital today. Would you mind if I came tomorrow?" And it worked really well. It was just a very nice relationship people had with their workers. Oh, okay. So here's the fun part. So how do you find out who's a good housekeeper and who's not? Well, I can teach people how to clean, but the question is, and the question I asked myself for everyone who applied for a job was, would I send this person to my mother's house? Because back then, hard to say this now, we were working for old people.
Yeah, how did we end up there? I don't know.
And so that my mother was the test. Would my mother be comfortable if this person was in her home? And that was a really good sign for me about how to judge people.
Was it difficult? I assume at times you had to let people go. Was that difficult to deal with?
Actually, I never did.
You never did. That's amazing.
They always either found a different job or moved or did something else. But no, I never had to fire anybody.
And did most of your employees stay long term, or was there a lot of turnover?
It was fairly steady. The people who were doing the non-cleaning stuff, who also could do cleaning, were long term. And the cleaning people were, there was one woman who was with me the whole time, and a couple more who were pretty long time. One of them died, unfortunately, had an unfortunate medical issue. But mostly, yeah, they were there. And the more people I had, the more people heard about us, the more people wanted us. So it was really good for everybody.
Did you charge? Did
you
you
hourly? Mm-hmm. Charged by the hour instead of by the job, because that way, if you ran into a problem, then you had time to fix it and you weren't being unhappy. The other thing was with cleaning, if somebody's doing house cleaning and you say, okay, she'll be there for 3 hours and she works for 3 hours, and they call me up and say, but she didn't do this and this. I said, then next time you need more time. We also had an interesting thing here in the college area, which we called shovel jobs, which were one-time cleaning jobs. And we charged more for those because it was much more intense. And truly, there were times we had to take shovels in and clean out things.
Wow. I have to say, my wife and I go to estate sales, and we've been in some of those places, the ultimate hoarders, I would say.
Well, the ultimate hoarders, and then so here we have college town, college professors, sabbaticals come to town, rent a place, furnish it, and leave.
Sure.
I used to have great tag sales. I would say, so Smith College would hire me, and I would say, do you care what I do with the things? I hate to take all of this to the landfill. Can I take it home and sell it? Yes, just don't charge me for your time you're doing that. Fine, I'm good on that. So I had great tag sales, paid for our vacations for years.
Wow. It reminds me, I live not too far from RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute.
I know RPI.
When they check out in the spring, you just drive down the street and there's all this.
Exactly. Exactly. Actually, here now, they have set up an area where if you have good furniture, you can leave it. And then if somebody's coming in the fall, they can get it inexpensively, which is nice.
It's kind of embarrassing to admit, but when I first met my wife 20 years ago, I was living in an apartment complex. It was a little bit of an upscale apartment, and it was a fairly large complex. And at the end of every month, when people would move out, of course, they'd toss out whatever they didn't need. And so at the end of the month, I would just walk around the complex, which was a full mile to make the loop. And there'd always be furniture and things like that. And you walk around my house and people go like, "Where'd you get that?" And I go, "Well, I got it out of the trash." It wasn't really in the trash. It was next to the dumpster, but it's quality stuff,
So going on from there, my wife and I also built and opened a self-storage business. And that's the interesting piece, because the college students rent a storage space and they pay it for years and years. And all of a sudden think, why am I paying $25 a month? What is in there? I haven't missed it. I don't want it.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't pay. And then we say, we're going to auction. This was the early auction wars that they talk about, but long before that was popular. So because of the legality, if we auctioned it and did it illegally, we were liable for 3 times damages. If, however, we owned the stuff, we didn't have to auction it, or we could auction it and it didn't matter. So we would say, okay, if you sign this over to us, you are free and clear. If you don't sign it over to us and we sell it and we don't make the amount that you owe us, we're going to report it to the credit bureau as debt.
Wow.
And so a lot of people signed it over, and a few people who didn't have reached out to us later to pay off their debt, to clean up their credit bureau thing because they wanted to buy a car or whatever. But the stuff that we would get once we got a car.
Wow.
Once we got a $6,000 set of drums. It was amazing. Just turned over to us.
You would think it'd be worth getting that stuff back,
Well, they didn't want it. So, okay.
I happen to know it, but why don't you mention the name of that business? I really like it.
That was Stuff It Storage.
And do you still own it, or you sold it off?
No, we sold that.
Does it still exist?
It still exists. It's on Route 9 in Hadley.
Wow. So you did free advertising for them.
See? And I should. They did well by me. They made it possible that we could retire.
So I was going to show you these. Are those your ads?
Yes. It's at least my phone number. I don't know if it's my ad, but
Yeah. Well, it says Rent a Wife Incorporated, serving Amherst, Northampton. So I assume that's yours. These are pretty early on. These are from January of 1981. So you wouldn't have been in business, probably more than 6 or 8 months, I would bet.
was just starting. Yeah.
Anyway, I just love them because every ad was a little bit different. Need a handyman, sick in bed. What else do we have here? Daily house check.
Oh, I did a lot of that when people were away. If they wanted somebody just to go in and either water their plants or make sure nothing was going on, or that was good money. One of the jobs we had was for one of the apartment complexes, because they were having problems with students withholding rent because they had vermin, which is a legal thing to not pay your rent for. And they had a suspicion that a lot of people didn't have cockroaches, but were buying them from someone else in the unit.
Wow.
So it was my job to do 2 things. One is to get all 150 units ready on a rotating basis to be exterminated once every 3 months. And the other was to try and figure out who it was that was selling them. So what I did was to put cockroach traps under everybody's sink and mark them with their apartment numbers. And so there was one apartment number that you could tell had cockroaches, but you could also see cockroaches had been lifted out of the traps because there were legs left on it. Those could be shown as evidence that other people had cockroaches in their apartment and why they weren't paying. Anyway, that was an interesting job.
Quite the detective work there, huh?
That was fun. That was really fun.
What is besides that, any other crazy things? I did read in one of the earlier articles on you about your service that you had to witness a will.
Oh, that we did that often.
Wow.
People who lived alone needed the lawyer would come to the house and they would need a witness, so they would hire me to come and be there.
Huh.
Say that they were of sound mind and body, and were not necessarily body, and were able to sign this part of this article.
I bet you never envisioned the business would take that on when you started it, did you?
Oh no, there were so many things that I never envisioned. For instance, one of the things we did was to take kids, now mind this, we're 1982, 1983, take kids to doctor's appointments because their parents were too busy to do that. Okay, that's fine. We can do that. But they wouldn't pay me to take care of a child to the same level that they would pay me to take care of their pets. Pets were worth more money than children, even then, which I find fascinating.
My parents owned a pet shop, as I mentioned when I first signed on with you. People spend incredible amounts of money on their pets. It's my parents, they're deceased now, but they closed their pet shop maybe about 18, 19 years ago now. And even back then, people would come in and buy a rawhide bone for their dog. This giant rawhide that was $20, and the dog would chew it up in like 10 minutes. And I'm like, holy cow. I mean, why don't you just burn your dollar bills,
Yeah, really. I've had that sense about a lot of things in my life.
Are your kids local? Or are they around the country or?
Yeah, around the country. I have one in, she just moved. She's down in Santa Cruz, California.
Mm-hmm.
I have one in Philadelphia, one in North Carolina, and 2 in Massachusetts still. 6 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Did you do all the PR for the business or?
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah. So you came up with the catchy slogans and things like that?
Yeah. And at one point I hired a general manager because it was getting I really like being out doing things. And I was spending all this time in the office. So I was introduced to this person who would like to do this kind of work, and turned out he was perfect, and he could do all the things I could do, and we were very similar, and we got on really well. And so he was general manager, but he could do anything, but he especially loved to clean. He was a gay man. And a gay man who loves to clean is a gem. And I would say to a new client, well, I'm going to send Bob. And they would say, oh, I don't want a guy. I said, let me send Bob. And if you don't like him, I'll send you a female the next time. Oh, no, please send me Bob every time.
Right. So, I mean, how many men, I mean, obviously the business started as Rent a Wife originally, right. Although you did change the name. How many men did you have working for you?
2 or 3 out of the whole group. So not a lot.
And I noticed in one of your ads, you were actually looking for people to work for you, and you wanted women who had more than 10 years in the home. Is that correct?
Right. So one of the interesting things I found is that women who had children were how do you say this? Were not afraid to put their hand in the toilet and clean it. People who didn't have children, that was like, give me a brush and rubber gloves and all the disinfectants in the world. No, there's a huge difference there from people who have handled bodily wastes.
Although I have to say I've never had kids, but I have no problem doing that kind of stuff. Did you have to make a big investment to start the business, or was it pretty much on a shoestring?
No, the bank would loan me the money, so I made myself a loan and I systematically paid it back.
Wow.
And I actually incorporated the business, which was a fairly major cost, but I wanted to protect my own assets. So if somebody sued the business, I was independent of that. I had to take care of my finances.
Now, was this while you were still Rent a Wife, or you already changed the name?
When I became Jane of all trades. Mm-hmm.
Good thing your name was Jane, huh?
Well, it would have been something else. I would have had a different name. Jane of all.
That worked out well.
Yeah.
Your clientele, would you say they were mostly women? Because, I mean, with Rent a Wife, when it first came on the scene, when I started, when I looked at the original articles, most of the clientele was intended to be male. But then over time, what these women realized is that most of their clientele were women. Is that what you found?
I had a lot of couples. I had elderly women because men had already died off, but there were a few elderly men who needed things. I mean, at that point, and I understand it better now, they wanted somebody to come and change their light bulbs, climb a ladder, do things that elderly people are wise not to do. And so, we serve two populations. We serve the faculty of the colleges and other town residents. I don't mean to say it's exclusively college people, but there were also the older people who couldn't do things anymore.
And did sometimes their children contact you to arrange the services, or?
No.
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 That's kind of surprising because, having had elderly members of my family, their children have had to go out of, try and find somebody who could go in and do this kind of stuff.
But this was before home services were a real popular thing. This is long before you had, what do they call it? Merry maids and things like that.
Right.
Home services were not something people were willing to think about as a business. It was sort of under the table, but I didn't want to do under the table. I didn't think that was fair to employees.
Mm-hmm. Looking back, would you say pretty much you have a fond recollection of the business, or?
Oh, absolutely. I loved it. It was great. There were always new things. I love solving problems, and every day was a new problem to fix.
Mm-hmm. Do you miss it?
I miss physically being able to do the things for my own home that I used to do for other people.
So after you closed the business and turned it over to your employees, basically, you ran a B&B for a while. Is that right?
We ran a B&B, and we lived on 2 acres, so we had a lot of gardens, and perennials always need dividing. So we sold perennials in the front yard. It was like Hadley's a very, especially back then, open farm community. And you put a little coffee can out and say, put your money in the can. You put a price tag on it, and people would leave their money. It was that easy. And we planted Christmas trees and had a Christmas tree farm, and that was cut your own, and it's by the foot, and here's a measuring stick, put your money in the can. It was fun. We did a lot of different things. And we also had an art rubber stamp business.
Wow.
Which was called Rubber Tree Stamps. And that was fun. My wife is an artist, so that was easy. It actually is her fault. She one day said to me, would you go see if that woman that closed her rubber stamp business has any wood blocks for me to mount my stamps on? And I came back and I had bought the business. So she said, did you get me the blocks? I said, well, yeah, I got you a little more than that.
And how long did you have that business for?
We had that till 2006. That's really when we retired. That's when we sold the storage business and we sold the rubber stamp business, and we moved to a smaller house because I realized as I was getting older, I wasn't going to be able to take care of our big old New England farmhouse.
Mm-hmm.
So the bed and breakfast was a great thing to do with a big house because ours had 13 rooms in it.
Wow.
And I'm pretty smart with money. And if you have an investment, it should be earning money for you. So here we have money invested in the house. What's it doing? It's sitting here. So we have empty rooms. And there was a lesbian couple up in the Berkshires, the only other lesbian B&B in the area, that broke up and therefore closed their bed and breakfast. But one of the women was working for Jane of all trades. Surprise. And she said, why don't you open a bed and breakfast? I'll teach you everything you need to know. So we did.
But what did that involve? I mean, was it just a matter of keeping the place? I mean, you were able to just go off and do what you needed to do, I assume, while this is going on.
Right. I worked out of the house, but the Chain of all trades the offices were there. We had, before we made it a bed and breakfast, we had made it had been a 2-family house. So the downstairs was the rental part, and that turned into the bed and breakfast.
Wow.
So we had our own space anyway. And then the bed and breakfast was secondary. And it was great. As people said, oh, isn't it a lot of work? And I always said, no, I have 5 children. These people just come and they give me money and all they want is breakfast and they know where a good restaurant is. It's
Okay, so you had a B&B,
yeah,
you had a storage facility, you had
yeah,
a rubber
tree stand.
a rubber stamp company,
Yeah,
and then you decided to retire, the two of you,
yeah.
and now you're very active in your community, from what I heard. So why don't you talk about that?
Okay, so I got my invitation when I turned 60 to join the local senior center, and I read the newsletter and it said, we're looking for a driver. I love to drive. So I thought, I want this job. Here's something for me to do. This was even before I was retired. So I went and I applied for the job, and I was sure everybody else wanted to do it because there were all these people there and nobody else wanted it. So I got the job to drive. And that started with taking seniors shopping or out to lunch. And after about a year, they started saying, Jane, we don't need to go shopping. We have everything we need. We like to go out to lunch. We like social, but we really want to go somewhere, but we don't know how to, we're not up to putting together a trip for ourselves. Can you take us overnight trips? Until you get involved in something, you have no idea. I mean, the number of rubber stamp magazines that exist, for instance, and conventions and all of these things. Same with storage. Who knew? Until you're in it, you have no idea of all the. So there are all these companies that do travel for seniors, and they put together really good trips at a reasonable price. I call up the company and I say, I want to go here. I've looked at your catalog, and they send me literature. I pass it out. People sign up. The bus comes, it picks us up, it takes us on the trip. It's got everything arranged, meals, rooms, entertainment. They bring us home. Wonderful. So I did that until up to this year when I've turned it over to somebody else.
Wow.
But we have done incredible things. We have the first, and it changes people's idea about seniors. The first senior group I took on a cruise to the Caribbean. I took 32 seniors.
Wow.
19 of them went zip lining. One of them, because it was her 70th birthday, went hang gliding.
Wow.
Okay, this is different than what most people think of seniors. So, and the Hadley Senior Center is really great in terms of what it offers. I can't say enough about it.
And you're also, it's not the planning board you're on. I'm trying to think what you're on.
Select board.
And what does the select board do?
Well, the select board runs the town. But that came about because I was in the senior center, and the senior center needed a new building. So I ended up being chair of the building committee because I had a lot of building skills. And so we got this great new building. But in the process, I had to sit in select board meetings to clarify any questions they might have or straighten out things they might be incorrectly saying. And I thought, wow, I didn't know the town did all this. I think I want to be on the select board. So then I decided to run for select board.
And how long you been doing that?
I'm in my 5th year.
Wow.
They're 3-year terms, so I'm up next year and I'm not going to run again.
No?
I'm too old. I mean, it to do it conscientiously takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I want to, do things with my wife and not be as committed.
Yes, I totally agree. Anyway, Jane, I really appreciate you doing this. I just want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day to, share your story with my listeners.
Well, I'm happy to do it. It's been fun.
Bye.
Thank you.
Wasn't Jane great? I have to tell you, we spoke for close to an hour, and I enjoyed every single moment of our conversation. If you'd like to hear more about Jane's life, she sat for a lengthy interview on April 9th of 2022. And that video is posted on the Forbes Library website. That's Northampton's public library on their website. And I'll post a link to it in the show notes. Plus, I'll put it in the transcript of the story, which will be on my website, uselessinformation.org. That's uselessinformation.org. The Useless Information Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, so be sure to visit airwavemedia.com, and there you'll find a curated selection of some of the best podcasts out there. Anyways, thanks for listening, and take care, everyone. Bye.